entered the ministry, you did not buy in what the church was doing. What did you think the church was doing?
Back then?
Yes, before you entered the ministry.
Well, I knew that it was mostly talk. I mean, even as a kid sitting there in the United Church, I knew that you could just tell things. As kids are very intuitive, right? And they knew that these people aren't living what they're claiming. I mean, they're not loving one another. Is anyone coming over to our house when we're struggling? My dad doesn't have his job anymore. We had to move down to a hotel in the downtown part of Vancouver. Were any of the church people coming over and helping us? No, not even the minister. You know, we were the pariah family all of a sudden. So I knew it was bullshit. But that didn't take away from what I felt in here was a message of Jesus, which to me was revolutionary. It wasn't
so where did it go wrong, Kevin?
Well, you cut me off there. Wait.
Sorry.
It wasn't just that Jesus was a nice guy, right? You're the benign, kind of loving man. It was like the hippie, right? That's never how I saw him. I saw him as a revolutionary. He got murdered because he was challenging the powers on behalf of the people who didn't have any voice, on behalf of, the outcasts. I mean, the woman who was going to get stoned to death, or the people who are on the outside all the time, the guys who get shit on all the time. They finally had a champion. And he said, not only am I your champion, but God is too. God loves you more than the asshole is doing that to you. And that's a revolutionary thing to do. And it was beautiful. I mean, it was like to me a new world. And I saw the church perverting that message. I saw them taking the side of the wealthy and the powerful, and they do this all over the world. They crucify Christ again and again, just like they're crucifying the poor. And I said, that's got to stop. I mean, that lie has got to stop. Well, it's like the early Roman Empire. They realized, look, we're not defeating these people. The more people we burn in the Colosseum and throw into the lions, the more people are being converted. They have a moral power here that's growing in the world. Our soldiers are becoming Christians and are saying we don't want to fight anymore. The whole empire was unraveling. So they were smart. They said, you can't destroy a movement like this. You can co-opt and pervert it. And that's exactly what they did. They opened the door. They said, come on in and sit down, guys. Take a seat in the empire. We'll turn you into something successful. We'll give you power so you can convert people. We will give you the means to conquer in this world. You don't have to be persecuted anymore. And they accepted it. They turned their back on Christ. They shut the door on him. And they became the church. They became Christendom, and they got blood all over their hands as a result. But he's still outside the door there. And I was trying to open the door. When a lot of the stories began to hit the press about, when the lawsuits began against the churches and the government of being brought by residential school survivors, at that point the church decided to, quote, delist me, which was to actually throw me right out altogether.
The person who had arranged the hearing, he was the executive secretary of the church out here, Brian Thorpe. And he had arranged the hearing, chosen the panel members. The hearing was in the room of the church of a friend of his. And in addition to that, he was one of the four testifying against Kevin. I mean, here where judge and jury and the whole thing gets blurred, I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here?
This is natural justice, isn't it?
And this was natural justice. But this whole business of them, they knew I was taking notes on all the things that proved there was nothing going on according to natural justice. They saw me writing it down each time.
Did they know who you were at the time?
No, they
did. Did they know your background, or did they just think you were some busybody woman?
Oh, they just thought I was a little old lady with very little to do. But after the first week there, I realized this was Canadian history, United Church history, and Native history.
And deserves to be told.
And I made a point of trying to be there all, 36 days of the hearing that went over 6 months.
It was the first public and only public delisting of a minister in United Church history. It was really like a show trial to make an example of me. But at that trial, the lawyer for the United Church, a fellow called Ian Benson, he said the reason these Reverend Annett is being recommended for delisting is not because of anything he did while in the ministry, but because of comments he's recently made to the press about the deaths of children in Indian residential schools. So they were very clear. They wanted to get rid of me because I was continuing to talk about these deaths and murders. So in the period after I was fired from my job in Port Alberni, my wife and family and I had to move back to Vancouver where I could seek out retraining of some kind. I enrolled at the University of British Columbia. And basically at that point the attitude of the church was to put me on ice and try to ignore me. And it wasn't until February 1996 that they suddenly revived their demand that I be expelled from the church altogether. And interestingly enough, they did that 2 days after
it was publicly announced that the first lawsuits would begin against the United Church and the federal government, brought by survivors of the Alberni residential school. A lot of these plaintiffs that were suing the United Church had been in my congregation. I had been working with them, providing them information. Obviously, the church wanted at that point to just expel me from the church altogether.
The purpose of the hearing was a total railroading and a processing to get somebody who had far too much information for his own good out of there. He had stepped on big toes. He had stepped on moneyed toes. And the whole thing was to get Kevin Annett out of there.
So sure enough, that same year in 1996, the United Church decides to go ahead and defrock me as a minister. I think the antiseptic term they used was delist. And in so doing, they spent over $250,000 tossing me out of the church. Something I found pretty repugnant, because that previous year, the church had told me that they couldn't come up with about $1,000 a month to feed the over 300 hungry families that we're providing food for through our Loaves and Fishes food bank in Port Alberni. And yet here's settling $250,000 to get rid of one whistleblower. Also, the two men who had originally arranged my firing from Port Alberni, John Jessamine, the lawyer for the United Church, and Brian Thorpe, the chief executive officer in BC for the church, these are the two guys who are not only responsible for my appeal, but for setting up the panel that's going to decide whether I'm going to remain a minister or not. So the whole thing from start to finish was a complete travesty of justice.
It was terrible. At moments, I really wondered if I were in Guatemala or Mexico, rather than this quiet, late summer afternoon in this church in downtown Vancouver. I couldn't believe the things I was hearing. The whole thing, I mean, I just remember, for example, that Kevin Annett had a great number of unsolicited letters of commendation for his work and his ministry. And he had always made his ministry a tough ministry, a challenging ministry. And I think that all these letters had come in, and not one of them was allowed to be read. I believe Mr. Jessamine said, people here can read for themselves, these letters don't need to be read. But isn't it interesting that at the end of that hearing, Mr. Jessamine didn't have the same philosophy at all? Because when they solicited letters against Kevin Annett, and we know this from a person who phoned in from Manitoba, when they solicited these letters, all of those were read and put on the record.
You know, for centuries, people have had three basic rights under common law. Those are, the first is the right to no charges being brought against you. The second, the right to face your accusers. And the third, the right to a trial before your own peers. Now, all three of those rights, called natural law, were totally denied me by that proceeding that threw me out of the United Church altogether as a minister. To give you an example of that, I was never told what the charges were against me. They repeatedly said, there are no charges against you. I asked to face my accusers. I said, who are the people who brought these concerns to you about my ministry? They refused to tell me who they were. And finally, when I'm appearing before that delisting panel, they weren't in any way my peers. They weren't people who I knew. They were three hand-picked individuals who were actually friends and associates of one of the men who had me fired, Brian Thorpe.
I feel it will remain a very black mark against the United Church of Canada. It was a very disgusting type of procedure. I would call it a witch hunt. It was a question in my mind as to why a church would be carrying out such an activity, why they would be spending the money. I mean, there are many aspects to this. I think probably the important one is an attempt to simply break down a personality, and why they should be wanting to do this. Reverend Annett was someone who had the trust of the natives, of those underprivileged. And it seemed to me that the church should have been making use of him.
Finally, one of the most absurd things is, right at the very beginning of the proceedings, we asked the panel, what are the grounds for defrocking a minister in the United Church? We have to know that in order to mount some kind of defense, to show that, in fact, I am a credible minister. Molly Williams, who was head of the panel, said, in front of all of us, she said, there are no grounds for delisting a minister. We will decide what those grounds are at the end of the hearing. So by doing that, there was no way I could mount a defense, because I didn't even know what the terms of the whole hearing were.
I mainly took down notes of things where events in that hearing did not conform to the laws of natural justice. In the first place, there was no charge. There never was a charge through the whole hearing. Now, the church people have lied about it since and said there was a charge. There absolutely wasn't. If they want to look at the church records, there was no charge. They kept saying there is no charge. We only want to see if Reverend Annett is suitable for ministry or not. The charges never even got made up. The first I saw of them was late March with a letter that came out in the Courier where suddenly I saw charges listed against Kevin Annett. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense that went on, but very dangerous and very hurtful nonsense.
People who I counted on as who would stand by me, they all ran for the hills. I mean, people in the churches, it was kind of like, I call it the leper complex. They know to stay, give you a wide berth, because if they get close to you, it might happen to them too. So I was pretty much ostracized. And speaking of South African apartheid, it's like being a banned person. In South Africa, when you were banned, you couldn't meet with more than two people. Your name couldn't be mentioned in the press, etc. That's basically the situation I'm in. The media won't cover my stuff. There's all this story out there about how Kevin Annett is crazy and trying to bring down the church and blah, blah, blah. And that's so that the people in the wider society never have to look at what I'm talking about, look at the evidence, because it's a way of keeping that evidence delegitimated, and it works.
I can't believe what went on there. And, I think that Jack Bell said it all. He just couldn't stand to watch it. It was obvious that you had stepped on some pretty big toes and that you were going to be slaughtered for it.
On March 7th, 1997, Kevin Annett was permanently expelled from United Church ministry, despite the failure of church officials to offer any evidence that he was unsuitable for that calling. His expulsion was final and could not be appealed. The same day, Kevin was issued a legal writ by church lawyers that tried to prevent him from speaking about his delisting trial or any issue involving Native people and stolen Indigenous land. Kevin ignored this gag order and continued to speak out publicly about his firing without cause and expulsion without due process from the church responsible for the deaths of so many innocent children.
Historically, it was interesting how everything was coinciding, because as I got thrown out of the church, the first lawsuits were being brought against the church and the government by the survivors of residential schools. This would have been in early 1996. And right at the same time, kind of like the attitude was, well, you got tossed out of the church, you must have done something right, kind of from the point of view of Native people. And they began to, the trust level went way up because I wasn't part of that institution anymore. And I was being invited down to these healing circles in the downtown east side of Vancouver to listen to people's stories. And then eventually they began to ask me to record them for them. And that's when I began to seriously document a lot of these stories that went.
Up until that point, you had not documented anything that was said at the
Well,
church?
I hadn't systematically gone about it. I had, written down notes and that people had shared with me, but it was clear from the things they were sharing that this went far beyond the physical and sexual abuses that are talked about in the press. Well, they're not talked much anymore about, but for a while they were. People were describing children being sterilized, being murdered, being used in medical experiments, being deliberately exposed to tuberculosis and then left to die. They realized, and I realized with them, that all we were doing is sitting around hearing everybody's sad stories, and it wasn't going anywhere. The people were not recovering from this. There were a lot of lawyers and Native politicians making money off their pain, but they weren't changing anything in their life. I'd know people who'd tell their story and then go kill themselves.
Well, was there a design to heal people, or was there just a design to have people talk?
Healing is a word from the dominant society. It's a way for people to make money off other people. People don't heal from this. That's the reality. The first thing to realize is that I'm never going to get over this, because it's not only so traumatic, but it's so systematic in the culture. You can't heal as a Native person. The whole society is arranged against you. What you can do is to tell the truth. And I realized that about myself. I was never going to recover from this. I'm never going to be allowed into the academic world. I'm not going to be allowed to have a job anywhere in Canada. And they actually threatened me with that. There was a guy called Art Anderson who was personnel officer for the United Church who had removed me. He had come in the day and handed me the letter that fired me. And he told Bruce Gunn, my friend, United Church clergyman up in a house, he said, 6 months after I was fired, he met him at a conference and he said, Bruce, if you have any pull with Kevin, you better tell him that he'll never work in this province again unless he plays ball. And sure enough, that was an idle threat. They blocked my PhD at UBC. Every time I went to apply for work, they had been spoken to, the prospective employer. That happened a few times. There was a systematic campaign. So I knew that, like with the Native people, I was never going to get over this. But what I could do, just like them, I could tell the truth. And that was our power, just telling the truth. And that's what we began to do. Okay, we got to do more than just talk about our pain. We got to ask the bigger question, why did it happen and who did it? And why did they do it, right? So we said the way to do this is to hold a big inquiry. And we started inviting Aboriginal groups from around the world and this United Nations group, IRAM, to come in. And that's what happened in the summer of 1998 in Vancouver. I organized a lot of the survivors to come and give testimony at this. And at that tribunal, anything you could ever imagine that went on in a Nazi death camp was described. There was a group of people from the Cooper Island Catholic school who described being part of a medical experiment in 1939 when German-speaking doctors were injecting them in their chests with these chemicals that was killing them.
I'm 100% sure that we're used as guinea pigs in these local hospitals for some unknown reason. We're lugged off the hospital, I can remember that. And I know it wasn't for dentistry, I know I wasn't sick.
I read Kevin Annette's document starting about 6 months ago, and it helped me understand how come my memory was so vague. In reading parts of it, they talked about shock treatment. In my last year there, the spring of 1961, I was taken from the school to Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, and from Charles Camsell Indian Hospital to Ponoka Mental Institute. I don't know if I was there a week or 2 weeks, but I have vague memories of it. But the memory that flashed back for me is laying on this table and stuff in my head, and then these flashing lights just continually.
They had put needles in my head and had hooked them up electrically and would zap me. At that time, my arms were put in a chair and locked in so I couldn't move. And my head was put on a brace in the back so I was like this, I couldn't move. And I can't tell you how long they had done it. All I remember is that I still, to this day, I still get a, like my brain will still have that kind of a kick from it, right?
Right.
And they had done a lot of bad things by putting medications in the food while I was in the dark room, bringing the food in, and you had to eat it, and if you didn't eat it, then if you threw it up into a bag, they'd put it on the plate again and make you eat it.
I also went to the tribunal that was held, and although I've been with Amnesty since 1961, I had to walk out of that tribunal as the sobbing went on around me, and the gulping for air, and the crying of the natives as they told their stories. And I couldn't imagine, Canadian men, policemen, fathers and grandfathers going in and taking children out of the arms of native parents and putting them on a gunboat and taking them to these schools like Port Alberni. That all came out at that tribunal. I thought, my goodness, how could they take little 5- and 6-year-olds? And as a grandparent myself with a little 5-year-old, how dependent he is on family. How could they take those children to these schools where at best they were treated with indifference, but as we know, so much worse went on there.
We've had Chief Harry Nice, we've had Chief Joe Gosnell, we've had Chief Ernie Cray sitting in this room with tears in their eyes describing it to me themselves on television. I mean, it happened. We know it happened, and it happened in our lifetime, right?
That's
It's not 150 years ago.
Was there proof, though? Like Nazis had
Scars. They showed me the scars, and they also...
anything written down? Any doctors write down that they went through it?
I did find documents in the Indian Affairs Archives describing these doctors, and how what was interesting was the order that was running the school, a Catholic order called the Montforts. As soon as some children escaped from these experiments, they went to the local, their families. The local police refused to return the children to the school because of these horror stories they were hearing. The next day...